Russian troops are gradually losing control over Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. This was stated by the Joint Forces Group. Ukrainian forces continue clearing operations in the northern districts of the city, and the Russian army units that remain in Kupiansk have been left without proper supplies and are now in more difficult conditions than Ukrainian forces were previously.
Communication for Russian troops has been cut off. It now only happens via drones. Attempts to resupply or drive vehicles into the northern districts are effectively blocked by Ukrainian strikes. In other words, they can't effectively supply the troops that are in the city, but they can drop certain supplies or ammunition to them. Viktor Tregobov, head of communications for the Joint Forces Group, speaking live on the United News Marathon.
81 times in the past day, the Russian army assaulted the positions of Ukraine's defense forces along the entire front line, according to the calculations of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In the Kustiantinovka direction, the enemy attacked 15 times. Defense forces repelled 9 more Russian assaults on the Slavyansk section of the front, and in the Alexandrovka area, Russian troops tried to break through the Ukrainian defenders' lines 7 times near 5 settlements. On the Pokrovsk bridgehead, Russian occupiers tried 18 times to push Ukrainian armed forces fighters from their positions. According to the Ukrainian military command, fighting took place in the areas of 10 settlements. Military experts are convinced that the Ukrainian army is capable of holding back the enemy in this direction, as clearly shown by the statistics from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. After all, Russian losses are significant, while their territorial gains are quite modest, analysts say.
The situation there is defined by the term mixed positions. That is, in the southern part of Pokrovsk, our units often operate in near encirclement, but nevertheless, they are able to receive the necessary resources in time to continue these combat operations. In the northern part, right after the railway into Pokrovsk itself, Russian units often find themselves surrounded and are forced to fight defensive battles under such conditions. But the key factor, in my opinion, that will continue to influence the situation on the battlefield in this sector of the front is the enemy's attempts to finally close the pincers of operational encirclement.
The occupiers keep raising Russian flags to convince everyone of their victorious advance, experts say. In particular, the enemy is using this tactic today in southern Ukraine in the Huyapola direction.
The Russians are trying, in those ruins, not the ones they capture, but the ones we leave behind for tactical reasons because the fortifications are destroyed, to hang up their tricolor rags. Obviously, this is a good, let's say, thing for our spotters, who then adjust the fire. Accordingly, these strikes are carried out against Russian personnel.
Meanwhile, the total losses of the Russian occupiers have already exceeded 1,159,000 people, of which 1,160 were eliminated in the past day, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. According to their data, the Russians also lost 2 more tanks, 3 armored fighting vehicles, and 17 artillery systems the day before. 2 air defense systems and a multiple launch rocket system were also destroyed. In addition, more than 200 drones and over 70 vehicles were destroyed.
Over 150 combat clashes took place on the front lines in the past 24 hours. Almost a third of them were in the Pokrovsk direction, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The situation remains difficult in the Konstantinivka, Alexandriivka, and Hulyapol directions, where the number of Russian assaults is in the dozens. In the North Slobozhanske and Kursk directions, Ukrainian defenders repelled 7 enemy attacks. In the South Slobozhansky direction, the Russians tried to advance on the defense forces' positions 6 times. We'll discuss the situation at the front in more detail with our guest. Serhii Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, has already joined us on the air. Serhii, welcome.
Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the defense forces. Greetings.
Glory to the heroes. Let's start with Pokrovsk, since it's the hottest spot on the front right now. What's the situation there now?
The situation hasn't changed dramatically today. Of course, we can't say that the situation is fully stabilized. However, there aren't any, let's say, large-scale news updates today that we could either please or, even worse, upset our viewers with. Very fierce fighting continues between our units. There are a lot of firefights happening in various neighborhoods of the city. And today we're saying, for example, that the southern part of Pokrovsk is indeed mostly controlled by Russian forces. The central part of the city is largely a gray zone. The Russians are also trying to advance into the northern part of Pokrovsk. They're met with gunfire in there. So these groups are appearing, and really are trying at least, to find loopholes like that. to locate and breach our defensive lines. But in fact, they're being destroyed there. That's why the situation really remains very difficult. This direction is truly the hottest, because Donetsk region is the occupiers' dream, the one they want to realize in the near future. I want to remind you that the capture of Pokrovsk, the occupation of Pokrovsk by the Russians, was planned as far back as last year. In other words, it's a defensive operation, which is currently being carried out by Ukraine's defense forces, and it is yielding results. Yeah, the situation really is, I want to stress again, very difficult. The enemy has concentrated more than 150,000 personnel in this direction. Can you imagine, on such a small section of the front, the Russians are trying to concentrate such a huge horde? Accordingly, today, Ukraine's defense forces are managing to... We want to break the Russians' attempts to encircle Mirnograd because this is about logistics. Logistics are difficult today, but it's not as easy as it might seem for the Russians either, who are trying to bring in ammunition and personnel through the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. Accordingly, their logistical route is indeed shorter, which helps them more. However, the Russians are not achieving such successes on the battlefield. The attempt to break through to the settlement of Hershin is aimed at our main logistical artery, which continues to function today. There are also other alternative routes for supplying weapons, rotating personnel, evacuating the wounded, and unfortunately are fallen in Ukraine. Ukraine has established such routes. Of course they are. Under constant pressure both from the air and from the ground by Russian occupiers. However, these routes are helping us today to carry out a defensive operation, which is one of the most difficult along the front. Although, if we talk about the front as a whole, it's quite clear that, especially when looking at the recent events and developments in the Pokrovsk direction, today the enemy is also actively trying to act and operate in other locations and areas as well. This demonstrates their ongoing efforts across multiple fronts. Lines of combat engagement. However, it is precisely Pokrovsk today, by holding back this massive Russian army, that gives our forces the opportunity on other sections of the front both to restrain the enemy and, accordingly, to carry out, let's say, some counterattacks. In particular, and I say this cautiously so as not to jinx it, the situation around Kupiansk has stabilized a little bit. Moreover, some tactical positions that we lost just a couple of weeks ago have now been brought back under the control of our defense forces. And accordingly, all the other locations are also now, both informationally and otherwise, tied to the line of contact specifically in the Pokrovsk sector. A great deal depends on this section of the front when it comes to the enemy's further advance or retreat.
Sergei, let's go over this again on air because on various public platforms, you can see comments that spread panic, and it's clear that this is a special disinformation operation. People are posting, well, actually not people, but bots. Let's go over it one more time. There has been no withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from Pokrovsk. Is that correct?
Today, the defensive operation of Ukraine's defense forces is ongoing, just as it is in Mirnograd. Any decisions that are made today or in the coming days will be announced accordingly by the command of the defense forces. And all these decisions will be made based on those security factors that are connected to preserving the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. And today, not everything can be said on air because I understand that a lot of Russians are watching us. But even despite the fact that the situation remains very difficult for us, in the Pokrovsk-Mirnohad agglomeration, today it is quite possible that decisions may be implemented that will put certain units of the Russian army, let's say, in a very uncomfortable position, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The defensive operation continues. As of today, Pokrovsk is still ours, even though the enemy is indeed present in the southern part, is trying and is already appearing in the northern part of Pokrovsk as well. Nevertheless, the defense continues as usual.
Footage has appeared showing the occupiers hanging up their flags en masse. There are also videos. This is important to mention because these flags are literally just put up to shoot a few frames and then show them in their propaganda. And after that, they can leave for a few minutes while the flag is still hanging. This is yet another special operation aimed at exerting psychological pressure and intimidation. Against the defense forces, the defenders of Ukraine, what other methods do the occupiers use to destabilize the information agenda?
Well, in fact, we all witnessed how an information psychological special operation was carried out. one of Putin's people, who was also voicing, among other things, an actual invitation for so-called media to come to Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, neither in Pokrovsk nor in Kupiansk. These representatives of the so-called media never showed up, and obviously couldn't have shown up, and in Kupiansk, as I already mentioned, never at all, because the situation there for the Russians is currently not going their way. That doesn't mean that things have changed drastically for us and that everything is already over there. No, the fighting continues, but still. As for those Russian tricolor rags, which are often dropped from the air by drones specifically too, to unfold it, show it off, and end their not-so-wise life path right there. Because the defense forces, as you well understand, see all of this, take those coordinates, and deliver the appropriate strikes. What these flags are really missing is the most important thing, black bags, which the Russians should have been dropping instead. Yes, the information coverage of events in Pokrovsk and other parts of the front is very strong today from the Russian Federation. It's not even so much that all this media hype is aimed at Russian society. Today, these are precisely the efforts being made to create a certain emotional atmosphere for Ukrainian society, for our rear areas, which are supposed to see that the Russian army is advancing and nothing can stop it. That's why the Russians understand this perfectly and are trying to influence people's moods in this way through information. There's absolutely no need to jump into a grave. There shouldn't be any panic at all. The hard work of the soldiers on the front line must be matched by equally hard work in the rear for a shared victory. Anything can happen. There are all kinds of possible scenarios for Pokrovsk, even negative ones for us. But nevertheless, I want to say again, Pokrovsk is still defending itself today. Pokrovsk is still holding back a huge enemy army. And this is not just an achievement, but a true feat of our soldiers who continue to carry out this difficult task.
Sergei, another direction that's been discussed more and more in recent days is Zaporizhzhia. What's happening there, and how much have the occupiers stepped up their activity in that area?
The situation here is also, to put it mildly, not easy. Let's call things by the proper names. It's actually turning out to be very tough right now. The 5th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Federation, which is advancing in this sector of the front, is first of all probably the most combat-ready, one of the most capable units in the Russian occupation army. However, the Russians have also suffered huge losses here. According to some estimates, about 20,000 personnel. Of this 5th Army, that many were killed or wounded and unable to return to duty. So we understand perfectly well, this is 1.5, almost 2 divisions, definitely 1.5. That's a huge force. Accordingly, the 29th Occupation Army has been assigned to support this 5th Army, and they continue their offensive. Unfortunately, the offensive really is ongoing. The Russians have achieved some tactical successes. Today, the situation is becoming very difficult in the area of the settlements of Rivnopil and Solodke. Here, it's all about the high ground. And it's clear that today, the main task for the defense forces is not just to hold the enemy here, but to prevent them from gaining access to these heights. Because for us, the situation could definitely get worse if they do. Accordingly, the defense forces are carrying out the tasks assigned by the High Command. Decisions are being made to improve our position and to hold them back tactically. It's crucial to block the Russian onslaught, and it's especially important that in the Gulyaipol direction, right at these lines, we can block Russian actions. The Russians have clearly slowed down a bit in this direction today. Of course, this is also thanks to the defense forces. On the other hand, at the same time, the Russians are also regrouping their troops. They need to replenish their personnel. As I already mentioned, their losses are enormous. Accordingly, they need to acquire resources, both weapons and personnel, so that after regrouping, it seems the Russians will try to continue attacking in this direction. The situation is very difficult, and there's a lot of information noise coming from the Russians. Information hygiene is very important. And accordingly, we understand that in the next few days, we will probably see a change in the situation. How exactly will it change? It's obvious that the Russians, we are trying to stabilize the front line, or rather to straighten it out for ourselves so that there are no pockets, no centers of resistance on our side. However, this task will definitely not be easy for the Russian army today.
We saw how they moved in under the cover of fog, and then how many times it was reported in public channels that they suffered losses. 1 in 5, by the way, according to official information. Serhii, thank you very much for joining us. Serhii Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, was with us live. Until then.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.